You know what a mystery shopper is, where they pay these people to go in and they pay them to see how the employees were. And so he tells me the story about this mystery shopper who had come in 1 month earlier. And immediately when he told me the story about the mystery shopper, I knew the moment and the person. And I remember that lady, she came in and she was grilling me. She was trying to see what I was made of. And she was being belligerent. And finally I turned to her and I said, listen, lady, if you know so much about it, you figure it out. I've got other people to tend to. And I walked away. I know what some of you are thinking. Pastor Mark, your personality really hasn't changed much.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
Well, this morning I'm starting a brand new series entitled Dealing with Disappointment. One of the inevitabilities of life is disappointment. You will be disappointed, I promise you that. And if you aren't, I will make sure I do it in the message today. I mean, it's just part of life, people. I mean, as long as there is pain and suffering and death in life, you will face disappointment. It just goes with the territory. It's what happens in life. And one of the things that we are challenged with, of course, is who we want to blame. And that's always sort of a bit of a problem, is that we shouldn't be blaming people, but we tend to. And sometimes we blame others for our disappointment. Sometimes we blame ourselves. And dare I say, sometimes we blame God. And we're going to be looking at all three of those things over the course of this series. But this morning, we're going to look at it this way, is that you cannot avoid disappointment. So what you need to do is you need to learn how to deal with disappointment. Well, this morning, my message is entitled, Appointment with Disappointment. And you know, our disappointments in life are actually sort of appointments. And Jesus promised us disappointment. He worded it a little differently, but he said this. He said, you will have tribulation in this world. That is a promise. I bet you there's not one person in this room that has that scripture up on your fridge. But it's a promise nonetheless. He said, as long as you live on planet Earth, you are going to suffer disappointments. You're going to suffer tribulation. It's going to come your way. It's just part of life. But here's what we're going to discover this morning, is that the disappointments in life are actually appointments for God to move in your life. They are actually appointments with destiny. The disappointments in life, this is what happens with them, is they are things that redirect. Every time you're disappointed, you get a new direction. Am I right about that? Every time you get a disappointment, you have been detoured in another direction because what you thought was going to happen didn't happen. You were disappointed. Now you're moving in another direction. And what happens is these disappointments actually point you in the direction that your life is meant to go, and God uses even those things to bring you to your destiny. You say, that doesn't make sense. Well, what did Paul say in Romans chapter 8? He said, all things work together for good? Is that what he said? All things work together for good? Notice how he didn't say all good things work together for good. That would make sense. That's not what he said. He said all things. Good things, bad things, unfortunate things. Everything in life works together for good. There's a proviso though, right? Because I didn't finish the scripture. It says all things work together for good to those that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. You see, when we lay a hold of his purpose for our life, it doesn't matter what disappointments you face in your life. He's going to work it out for good. And the disappointments end up becoming appointments for destiny. And you will be surprised, and I'm going to tell stories about it this morning, about how disappointments in life directed people towards their destiny. You need to see the silver lining in the cloud, or you need to see the rainbow in the storm, or whatever metaphor you want to use. The point is, you've got to look past that disappointment, because on the other side of that disappointment, there's someone and something. You know, it's like this young man, met this girl. He had hardly known her very long, but he had fallen head over heels, and he decided to propose to her. And so he said, will you marry me? And she says, well, I have 3 questions for you. Number 1, do you have a house? He says, well, no, but she says, number 2, do you have a BMW? He said, well, no, but she says, number 3, do you even have a job? He says, no, but she says, well, no buts, but I'm not marrying you. I decided those were my 3 criteria, that any man that I married needed to have a house, needed to have a BMW, needed to have a job. So he went away disappointed. And he was talking to his friend. He said, I just don't understand it. Sure, I don't have a house, but I own 3 villas in the south of France. Sure, I don't have a BMW, but I have a Mercedes, I have a Porsche, I have a Ferrari. And of course, I don't have a job. I'm worth $100 billion. We need to be able to look past the disappointment because there's always something there that is unseen at first blush. Well, this morning, what I want to do in this message, An Appointment with Disappointment, is I want to look at the story of Moses. If there was anyone that was acquainted with disappointment, I mean, Moses had it coming both barrels. I mean, he was born into disappointment. I mean, here he was a Jewish man born in a time where they were held as captives, as slaves to the Egyptians. And if that weren't bad enough, he was born at a time where the Pharaoh decreed that all of the newborn males should be put to death. That's what Moses was born into. His mother, with the presence of mind to save his life, put him in a basket, you know the story, and floated him down the Nile River. Only to be discovered by whom? By Pharaoh's daughter, and was raised in Pharaoh's own house. I know when you watch the movie The Ten Commandments and you read that story, it seems like fiction, doesn't it? But it's stranger than fiction. This is a true story. And so he spends the next 40 years growing up in the home of the Pharaoh himself. Talk about a twist of fate that came out of disappointment. But that's really only the beginning of the story. See, what I want to do this morning is I'm going to give you 3 words from Moses' life, all about disappointments, that will help you deal with the disappointments that you yourself face. This is what they are. The first one is this: it's expectations. The second one is accusations. And the third one is supplications. You see, Moses was being brought up in Pharaoh's house, but he was conflicted because he knew he was a Hebrew, but he was being brought up as an Egyptian, so he was always tugged between these two forces. And that's where we're going to pick up this story in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11. It says this: Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to one who was in the wrong, Why are you striking your companion? Then he said, Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. So here we have this story where he knows that he is a Hebrew and he sees the hardship that they're under, and yet he seems to have power because he's living as an Egyptian. And so he has got kind of divided interests here. And so he's going to go help the Hebrews, but it didn't turn out as he expected, right? This is what happens when you have divided interests, when you're not sure which way you're going. You're like the guy that's dating 2 girls. You know, there's another term for that. You know what it's called? Singlehood. They're both going to dump you. And that's exactly what happened with Moses. Pharaoh hated him, the Hebrews hated him, everybody hated him, and so he ran off and he hid. He ran off to Midian, he went off. Now here's where I want to go with this word, expectation, because the very definition of disappointment is not having your expectations met. When he killed the Egyptian, which was a bad move, of course, but when he killed the Egyptian, what did he think? What was his expectation? His expectation was he thought the Hebrews were really going to appreciate him, that he was on their side. But it completely backfired on him, and this huge disappointment came in his life where now he was 40 years in Pharaoh's court, now he's off in the backside of the wilderness. And so what I want to say to you, this first point is this, is that your disappointments in life, they're really nobody else's fault but your own. We set ourselves up for disappointment with expectation. You say, Pastor Mark, what's wrong with expectation? Nothing. I'm a big believer in them. I just want you to know that the bigger your expectations, the bigger your disappointments. And the more expectations, which, by the way, again, I want to say, I believe in it. I'm a person of great expectations, but I'm also a person of great disappointments. Because the more expectations you have, the more likely you are to precipitate some disappointments in life. Because guess what? Things do not work out like you had hoped. Period. That's life. Deal with it, right? Which is what this message is all about. It's about dealing with the disappointments that come. You know, I got to tell you this story. When I was 10 years old, we had this ritual in our house, a bit of a tradition at Christmas, that on Christmas Eve, we always opened one gift. We were allowed to open one gift. And it was a little bit of a strategy of my mother's. I think she did it for her own sanity, was you let the kids open one gift, and as a consequence, then we had something to play with, and we were off her back, and it's kind of alleviated some of the Christmas tension. So that's the ritual that we had, the tradition. I don't do that in my home because I believe in delayed gratification, and I enjoy punishing my children. And so that's a whole different matter. But anyway, when I grew up, that was the deal. And so I remember one particular Christmas, like I said, I was about 10 years old. On Christmas Eve, my grandmother came over with the biggest presents I had ever seen in my life. They were these huge boxes. Now remember, you're 10 years old, and so a 2-foot box is up to your chest. And we looked with these big, huge eyes. Me and the 3 older brothers in the family all got the same gift, these huge 3 boxes. So when Christmas Eve came, we knew what we were opening. Because let me tell you something, all guys know this. Big always means better, right? That's what it means. And so we told my mother that we were all going to open the big gift. And my mother, to her credit, tried to talk us out of it. Because she knew it was in those boxes, and so she tried to point us, she said, why don't you open these small ones? It's good to open a small one on Christmas Eve. She was pointing to the G.I. Joes. We could have had G.I. Joes. That's what she was pointing. She was trying to save us. Oh, we wouldn't listen. Because big is better, and we were going for the big boxes. And so we made a pact that we would all open them at the same time so nobody's surprise would be ruined. And we were going to count 1, 2, 3, and we were going to tear into them and have this fantastic present, whatever it was. So there we were, Christmas Eve, and we counted down 1, 2, 3. We ripped them open and pulled out 3 magnificent quilts. My grandmother had given us quilts. I think you've all figured this out. No 10-year-old wants a quilt. There's G.I. Joes. G.I. Joes under the tree. And I'm holding up my handmade quilt that my grandmother had made. I can't wait to go to sleep under my new quilt. I don't think so. Because let me tell you something about disappointments. Disappointments are a very dangerous obstacle in your life if you don't deal with them right. I want to show you what I'm calling the disappointment iceberg, and I'm going to show it to you up on the screen. Here's the disappointment iceberg. And on your journey of life, on your voyage of life, I got news for you. You're going to hit a bunch of these icebergs. You're going to hit a bunch of disappointments. It's just life. It goes with the territory. As long as you're on planet Earth, you will have tribulation. You will have disappointments. And traveling in the dark and traveling in uncharted waters, you're going to strike not one, but many of these icebergs. But the big question is this. How are you going to deal with it? Are you going to glance off of it and keep going with the new direction, the new course that has been set? Because when you hit them, you're glancing off in a different direction. You have found a new purpose and a new direction in life, and you have to embrace your new journey. Or are you going to keep the course steady and tear the thing wide open and sink to the bottom like the Titanic? Because everybody knows that 90% of the iceberg lies where? Beneath the water. Show the next picture. See, this is what happens. Underneath disappointment is discouragement, disillusionment, depression, and defeat. You see, what happens when we allow disappointment to get a hold of us, guess what? It turns into discouragement. And discouragement turns into disillusionment. And disillusionment turns into depression. And depression turns us into defeat. These D words are bad. Have you ever noticed? There's no good D words. They're all bad. And, you know, it just takes one thing after another. And so we have to decide whether we're going to glance off the disappointment iceberg or if we're going to allow it to sink us to the bottom. And I know that there are people in this room that have allowed your encounters with disappointment to sink you. I know I've got lots of stories in my life. I hope I've learned a few things. But I know when I was younger, I didn't know how to deal with disappointment. And I reacted to them very often. Let me tell you a story about when I was 15 years old. When I was 15, I got a job. It was amazing that such a young kid under 16 was able to get a job, but I was. I worked at Canadian Tire when it was here on Pembina Highway in the sporting goods department. And I've always had the gift of the gab, and I just went and talked myself into that job, even though I was only 15. The next thing you know, I'm practically running the sporting goods department. Now, in my mind, let me describe who I thought I was. I thought that I was this amazing salesman in the sporting goods department that could sell, ice cubes to Eskimos. And the parents would come in with their children. I would always upsell them. Every 8-year-old walked out with a pair of CCM tacks because I had convinced the parents that if you want that child to go to the NHL, You need these carbon fiber skates so the blades are made out of kryptonite. It'll just sail them right into the NHL. So that's how I sort of perceived myself. In reality, I'm pretty sure I was that pimple-faced 15-year-old kid that when you walk into Canadian Tire and you say, does this stuff work on bare wood? He picks up the can and goes, well, on the back of the can it says, look, moron, I can read the can myself. Do you know anything about the product or not? No, of course not. He's 15-year-old. Have you not followed the story here? That's really, in reality, who I was. So here was the thing. When I started, I got paid $2.95 an hour. Even then, it seemed ridiculous, but that's what I got paid. And after a year, they gave me a raise. I was making $3.05 an hour. That is more money than you will ever need in your entire life. So then after my second year there, I'm now 17 years old, and it's raise season. We got raises once a year, a whopping 10 cents, and I could not wait. And there we were. I don't know why we did this, but this is what teenagers do. On payday, we all gathered around in the lunchroom. We all tore open our paychecks to look, and every single person around that table got a raise to $3.15 except for me. And I was stuck at $3.05. And did I mention how amazing I was as a salesman? And so I could not believe it. So I took my paycheck and I went up to my manager's desk and I threw it down on the desk and I said, "What's this all about?" Even at 17, I was brassy. "What's this all about?" Well, he sort of stumbled and bumbled a little bit, and he said, "Well, Mark, it really wasn't my decision. It was the general manager's decision." And I said, "Why? What's he got against me?" And he said, "Well, Mark, have you ever heard of a mystery shopper?" How many of you know what a mystery shopper is, where they pay these people to go in, and they pay them to see how the employees were? And so he tells me the story about this mystery shopper who had come in 1 month earlier. And immediately when he told me the story about the mystery shopper, I knew the moment and the person. And I remember that lady, she came in and she was grilling me. She was trying to see what I was made of, and she was being belligerent. And finally I turned to her and I said, "Listen, lady, if you know so much about it, you figure it out. I got other people to tend to." And I walked away. I know what some of you are thinking, "Pastor Mark, your personality really hasn't changed much." I didn't take guff then, I don't take guff now. But anyway, I blew that lady off. She gave me a terrible report, and now it was coming back to bite me. And so I was not getting a raise from $3.05 to $3.15. So he told me what had happened, not the incident, I remembered that. And he told me why I wasn't going to get a raise. And do you know what I did? I quit. I quit right then and there. I said, "I quit. This is my last paycheck. This is my last day. I'm done. If that's all you think of me, I'm out of here." And I grabbed that paycheck, I turned on my heel, and I walked out of that store, never to return. Well, except the next week when I went for an oil filter. But I walked out, and I was doing it for the principle of the matter, right? It's all about the principle, right? And I went home and told my dad about the principle that I had executed that day. He did not see it the same way I did. He could not believe that I had quit my job over 10 cents. And I said, "Don't you see the principle?" He said, "Don't you see the math here?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "You work 10 hours a week. It's 10 cents an hour. It's $1 a week. If you work 50 weeks a year, which you don't, it would be $50. You have quit your job over $50. I said, "Well, it's the principle of the matter." "No," he says, "it's the stupidity of the matter." Dad was right. I didn't get another job for over a year. But see, that's what happens with us is when we get disappointed, if we don't deal with the disappointment properly, if we don't allow our expectations to come into the new reality and to redirect our path, we will get sunk and we will go down into discouragement and disillusionment and depression and even defeat. So the first thing that we learn from the story of Moses is about expectation, that your expectations will precipitate disappointment. But the second word we want to look at is this word called accusations. Because what happens with disappointment is this: human nature is such that we will almost always look for somebody else to blame. We don't like to take the responsibility for it when things don't go our way. See, think about Moses for a minute. So he's 40 years in the backside of the desert. Finally, after 40 years, God gets a hold of him and says, "I want you to go back. I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to set my people free." Now, it takes some talking into, but he finally agrees to do it. And God says, "I'm going to be with you, Moses. You don't have anything to worry about. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to show my power." So Moses says, "Okay." He says, "I just want you to go walk up to the Pharaoh and say, 'Let my people go.'" So he walks up to the Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, no. So he asked him again, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, and he asked him again, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, and again and again and again, he said no, falling off the stairs. Finally, he agrees to let them go. And so finally he's got what he came for. It takes, the long story, complicated story, the plagues of Egypt, etc. But now they're headed out. He's got everybody, all 3 million of them, however many they were, heading out. But then Pharaoh changes his mind yet again. And he pursues them with his army, only to have the children of Israel come against the Red Sea. Now here's where accusation comes in. When they ended up at the Red Sea, it says the children of Israel murmured, and who did they blame? Moses. They said, what, there weren't enough graves in Egypt? You brought us out here to die? Way to go, Moses. You're a great guy. Way to go, Moses. And they accused him and they pointed at him. God does a miracle. They go across dry ground, across the Red Sea. They get to the other side. They come to a place called Marah. The waters are bitter. What did the people do? They murmured. Who did they complain to? Moses. You brought us here to this bitter water. You brought us here to die. So they move on from there. They go to a place called Meribah. At Meribah, there was no water at all. Guess who they complained to? Moses. God's giving them miracle after miracle. God's doing incredible things for them. He sends, there's no food out in the wilderness, so he sends bread from heaven. He sends manna from heaven every single day. And what do the people say? Moses, where's the beef? Right? Where's the meat? Who did they complain to? Again and again and again, they complained to Moses, and Moses, because he had this incredible character, he was able to deal with it every single time. He just seemed to have this capacity that even though these people were accusing him, he was able to carry on and just trust God for more. And they just kept on moving on, and he leads these people for 40 years. But I don't want you to miss this important part of this story, is that human nature almost always wants to blame somebody else for your problems. When we are disappointed, rarely do we want to take the responsibility. We look for someone else to lay that culpability on. Let me tell you one of the most incredible litigation stories in our modern time, and it's a story of Stella Liebeck. Stella was 79 years old. Her grandson actually, took her to McDonald's. It was in 1992. She ordered a 49-cent cup of coffee. She asked her grandson to park the car so she could add the cream and the sugar to her coffee. She put the cup between her legs, took off the cap, and some of you remember this story. She spilt the coffee all over her lap. She got third-degree burns on her thighs. Terrible thing. Nobody should have to suffer third-degree burns on their body, but this is what she did, and this is why you'll remember this story. She took McDonald's to court and sued them for her damages for $2.27 million and won. Now, of course, McDonald's appealed, and there's more to the story than that. But here's my question. I mean, that's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing for somebody to be burned like that and to have to face that. But here's my question for you. Was it McDonald's fault that she burned herself with the coffee? But yet, that's our human nature, is that we're unhappy, we're disappointed, we're disturbed by the situation, so we're looking for someone else to blame. Now, here's the problem with blaming other people. When you blame other people in the midst of disappointment, then you miss the purpose that God has in all of that for you. I mean, one of the great disappointments in Moses' life was 40 years in the backside of the wilderness. But here's my question for you. Would he have become the leader he became if he hadn't spent that 40 years back there? I mean, the Bible describes Moses as the meekest man that ever lived. Was that the man that killed the Egyptian 40 years earlier? I don't think so. That was a proud, arrogant man that had been brought up in Pharaoh's home. But 40 years in the wilderness was just the ticket to just drain any pride of life out of him that he had, any arrogance that he had. He was completely purged of that. And he became this humble and meek man that the Bible says was the meekest of all men. And he became a vessel that God could use. And I don't want you to miss the fact that his destiny was wrapped up in the fact that he had to go through those disappointments. And every disappointment that we face in life is really just setting us up for God's incredible purpose in our life. So when you face disappointments, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to allow them to bring you down, bring you into depression and discouragement? Or are you going to say, okay, I have an appointment with disappointment. I have an appointment with destiny. God is obviously at work in this. He's directing my path. And if we will embrace the moment, if we will embrace, I know this sounds incredibly counterintuitive, but if we will embrace the disappointment, we will find the new direction, and that new direction, more often than not, leads us to our destiny. So the first thing is this. The first thing is expectations. Our expectations precipitate and set us up for our disappointment. Once we get into disappointment, how are we going to deal with it? And how we deal with it is we don't look for someone to accuse. We avoid accusation. And the third and the final thing is this, and it's supplications. Now, supplication sounds like a fancy biblical word, but let me tell you what supplication is. It means prayer. Supplication means to ask. To supplicate means to ask. And supplications is just another word in the scripture for prayer. And when we look at the story of Moses, one of the incredible things about Moses is he had figured out the way you deal with disappointment. And the way you deal with disappointment is no matter what and how grave a situation you encounter, the one thing you do is you pray. You see, when they came up against the Red Sea, everybody was murmuring. Except for Moses, what was he doing? He was praying. He went down on his face and he began to pray and he began to supplicate before God. And God answered and God divided that Red Sea. When they came to Marah and the waters were bitter, what did Moses do? He prayed. When they came to Meribah and there was no water, what did he do? He prayed. The story goes on and on and on, and in every counter we see Moses had one response to disappointment and one response only, and that response was to pray, was supplications. Supplications is what we do when we're in the midst of disappointment, because the supplication is what will give us the answer and will point us towards our destiny. You know, Abraham Lincoln once said this. He said, "Many times I found myself on my knees, for there was nowhere else to go." Anybody in the room see the movie that came out recently, Lincoln? You saw Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, won Best Actor for it. That's the one I'm talking about, not Lincoln, Abe Lincoln, the Vampire Slayer. That's a different movie, came out at the same time. And Kathy and I went to see Lincoln, and I said, "Kathy, if this movie gets boring halfway through, I'm going to shout out in the middle of the theater, 'Where are the vampires already?'" The movie was good, so I didn't shut that out. And besides, I'd want her to go out on a date with me again. But I love this story about a humble man that knew a lot about disappointments. And the thing I love about these true historical stories is there are oftentimes people like Abe Lincoln and others. These are people that laid it all out. They put their entire careers and their entire life on the line to do what is right, to set free the slaves in America and to change the course of history. And they pay a very dear price to do it. But if there was anyone that was ever acquainted with disappointment, it had to be Abe Lincoln. And I'm going to close my message this morning with Abe Lincoln's resume. And I've put it up on the screen. You can follow with me. Here's his story. In 1832, Abe Lincoln lost his job. Also in 1832, he was defeated for legislature. In 1833, he failed in business. In 1834, he was elected to legislature. But in 1835, his sweetheart died, Anne Rutledge. In 1836, he had a nervous breakdown. In 1838, he was defeated for Speaker. In 1843, he was defeated for nomination for Congress. In 1846, he was elected to Congress, but in 1848, he lost the renomination. In 1849, he was rejected for land officer. In 1854, he was defeated for Senate. In 1856, he defeated for the nomination of vice president. In 1858, he was defeated for Senate. And in 1860, he was elected the president of the United States of America and went on to become one of the greatest shining examples of truth and righteousness and prayer and commitment, and signed the Emancipation Proclamation and set the captives free. That's what disappointment can lead you to if you will hang on and hang on and hang on. You will have tribulation in this world. There is no question about that. But be of good cheer, Jesus said, for he is on your side. Let me remind you something. You do not succeed in life despite your disappointments. You succeed in life because of them.
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.